Hello, everybody, and welcome to our June BARC Hall. I'm Zina Murati, Executive Director of ARF, here with ARF. And we also have Christine Kim with us and Katerina Kalergios from the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare. In 2015, the NYC Mayor Bill de Blasio made history by creating a position within the mayor's office that would serve as a dedicated liaison between City Hall and the animal advocacy community. And in November 2019, Mayor de Blasio signed the creation of an Office of Animal Welfare, which was the first office of its kind in the US. This law went into effect on March 25th, 2020. And the office has the power to advise and assist the mayor in the coordination and cooperation among city agencies for animal welfare administration, regulation, management, and programs. The Office of Animal Welfare is a mayoral office within the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit that extends the de Blasio's administration's vision for a fairer city to animal welfare. The office recognizes the exchange between human and social justice issues, environmental sustainability, and animal welfare, and therefore aims to facilitate solutions that address the integrated nature of these problems. And so with that, I will turn it over to Christine to tell us a little bit more about what they currently do and what the future of the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare looks like.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Zina. How's my audio? It's good. Great. I'm also going to share my screen. I have a short deck that I prepared for everyone. And please let me know if I'm not doing this correctly and you can't see it. How's that?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a guest presenter at ARF. I'm really happy to be a part of this meeting. I remember the first time that I learned about ARF, it was during COVID, actually, and I was doing additional outreach to kind of help provide resources to community groups who were really engaging the dog owner population in New York City. There was a lot of anxiety around dog park closures during COVID. And so there was a series of animal welfare webinars focused on animal behavior and what people who have dogs can do to really help exercise their dog during that time. And I think that's the first time that I connected with ARF, and it's a pleasure to be here almost a year later in very different times and happier times, I hope, for everyone. So again, thank you for having me. My name's Christine. I'm the director of Mayor Bill de Blasio's Office of Animal Welfare, which is housed inside of the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit. In 2015, Mayor de Blasio created what was the first and only position of its kind in the country. This position of animal welfare liaison was meant to be a link between City Hall and the animal advocacy community. The position is now codified into law to exist as the Office of Animal Welfare beyond this administration. So once Mayor de Blasio leaves office at the end of this year, the Office of Animal Welfare will continue to stay. And that's a voice for animals that will always live inside of City Hall that cannot be taken away. So the legislation creating this office was signed into law in November of 2019, and it went into effect on March 25th of 2020. If you've had a chance to look at the actual language of the law, it's fairly broad. The office has the power to advise and assist the mayor with pretty much any and all animal issues under the sun. But the guiding ethos, which frames the work for this office under this administration, is the Office of Animal Welfare is a mayoral office within the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit that extends the de Blasio administration's vision for a fair city to animal welfare. The office recognizes the exchange between human social justice causes, environmental sustainability, and animal welfare, and therefore aims to facilitate solutions that address the integrated nature of these issues. The mayor said it best at the bill signing for the Office of Animal Welfare. He said, "If our relationship with animals isn't right, then our relationship with the earth isn't right, and our relationship with each other as human beings isn't right. The humane concept is about all of us, and it's about everything. And that's really the quote that I use to inspire the guiding ethos that's on the landing page of the Office of Animal Welfare website. It's really what guides our work, which is very expansive, and you'll hear about all the different areas that we touch in just a moment. So while the establishment of the role of the first and only animal welfare liaison and also the first and only Office of Animal Welfare are huge accomplishments in and of themselves, there are other historic firsts for animals under this administration, which include the first and only non-lethal deer impact management plan and the first and only COVID-19 disaster animal response plan on the municipal level. Additionally, during this mayor's tenure, we have seen a historic package of 7 animal rights bills signed into law, including the Equine Heat Index Law, which suspends horse carriage activity under certain weather conditions, the ban of the sales of foie gras, and the prohibition of wild bird trafficking. As you can tell, the work is, again, quite expansive. So within the framework of this administration's efforts, the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare has identified 4 main focus areas in which our work is categorized. The 4 main buckets of work are companion animals, working animals, wildlife, and what I call human dimensions of animal welfare. I think the first 3 are pretty much self-explanatory. The human dimensions of animal welfare is usually the one that gets people's ears to perk up a little bit. They're like, what does that mean? And the human dimensions of animal welfare is really about the people who care for animals in New York City. So those are your animal guardians. Those are also your veterinarians and shelter workers. And they're also your animal advocates. So within this bucket of work of human dimensions, that includes things like being the liaison between all of these different communities and City Hall. It also means working on and advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the animal advocacy movement and within animal welfare professions. Combating the high suicide rates in the veterinary and animal welfare professions by extending the reach of the city's free mental health resources to these communities. And then also connecting vegan and vegetarian, minority, and women-owned business enterprises to city procurement opportunities to help us reach our meat reduction goals. And so those are just a couple of examples of what this bucket of work, human dimensions, actually means and how that plays out. So for the purposes of today's presentation and also in the interest of time, I could go on and on about this work and talk a lot about urban wildlife. I could talk about horse carriages, what have you. I'm going to focus mostly on companion animals today. So in this focus area, I've listed here some of the older accomplishments that actually predate my time, but these were also still accomplishments under Mayor Bill de Blasio. These accomplishments laid a really great foundation for the work of some of our more recent initiatives, and the recent initiatives mostly encompass the goal of reducing the intake at animal care centers of New York City, which is our municipal animal shelter system, and that includes improving pet policies in city-owned and operated housing, promoting humane solutions for community cats, and also removing barriers to care for animal guardians in low-income communities. Another project that I'd like to talk about today, which is actually something very complex and something that I'm incredibly proud of, is the Animal Hoarding Task Force. So early on, when I first started in this position, I had a meeting with the ASPCA, which is, we're very lucky in New York City to have them headquartered right here in New York City. And I asked them kind of, what are the most difficult things about your work, and what can an animal welfare liaison who sits at the mayor's office really do to advance animal welfare in New York City? And one of the interesting things that came up during that meeting was that they said they spent a significant amount of time in their community engagement department working on animal hoarding cases. And that is a really resource-intensive, labor-intensive thing that doesn't always amount to positive outcomes for those animals. What we have had in the past to deal with animal hoarding, or we've had, sort of criminal justice responses to animal hoarding, which is one tool out of what should be a various and diverse toolkit to address animal hoarding. So animal hoarding is a really complex problem which touches on many different areas in both human services and animal welfare, and also criminal justice. And so it really makes sense to bring all of the different parties to the table when looking at this kind of a problem. So for example, a person who is hoarding animals is really suffering from a mental health condition, and animal hoarding is a manifestation of a mental health condition. And so to bring social workers to the table, as well as NYPD Animal Cruelty Investigation and our partners at the ASPCA, really results in better outcomes for those animals, because we can have a multi-pronged approach to this problem. So in January 2020, we convened the first animal hoarding task force. And today we have a working group that stems from this task force. And we bring very complex cases to the working group. We bring multiple city agencies to the table based on the conditions of the cases that are brought to the table. And we have collaborative discussions about how we approach this and how we actually take animals out of those situations, and also get help for the person and address the root causes of animal hoarding. So for our animal shelters, there's also a lot to talk about here. Under the de Blasio administration, we have a lot that has been accomplished for companion animals and shelter animals. We've provided record funding for animal care centers of New York City. We've also expanded their board of directors. And perhaps the thing that I'm most proud of is that we are expanding and modernizing the shelter system. So we have invested $115 million in animal shelter capital projects. What we have right now are shelters that are actually quite old and have been shoehorned into existing buildings. So they were, buildings that were not built to be specifically for animal shelters. Once we're done modernizing the shelter system, we're going to have a completely new state-of-the-art animal shelter system that is going to change the face of animal welfare in New York City. We have currently 3 full-service animal shelters, one in Staten Island, one in East New York and Brooklyn, and one in East Harlem and Manhattan. So those existing shelters are getting complete makeovers from the ground up. In fact, the Manhattan Animal Shelter, the groundbreaking for the Pet Adoption Center was not that long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. So that work has already commenced, and it should be done relatively soon, within the next couple of years. And that's the first time we're going to have a standalone pet adoption center attached to our animal shelter, which is very exciting. For the other 2 boroughs, Bronx and Queens, we're going to have brand new full service animal shelters. So these are ground up constructions. In the Bronx, that shelter is going to be across the street from Co-op City, or in the Eastchester neighborhood of the Bronx, which is sort of the northern east part of the Bronx. And in Queens, the shelter is going to be in the Ridgewood neighborhood of Queens. So here we have a couple of renderings of what's to come. In Brooklyn, we have here a rendering of the existing shelter. The square footage currently is a little under 12,000 square feet. The proposed new shelter is a pretty significant expansion, as you can see here. It's being expanded to 2 stories, and the square footage is actually doubling. In Staten Island, here's another rendering. This shelter is actually almost done. So at the end of this year, people can actually visit the brand new Staten Island Animal Shelter. It's currently operational. We're just sort of putting the finishing touches on construction. So currently we are working on the parking lot and, you know, this exterior wall that you see right here. But most of it is actually completely finished. And so you can actually go visit them now. But if you want to see the full thing, parking lot included, you can visit later this fall or in the winter. And we're going to have a ribbon cutting ceremony for that. So stay tuned. But here's the rendering of the completed Staten Island Animal Shelter. Here's the location for the Bronx Animal Shelter, which will be at 2050 Bartow Avenue. It'll be about a 50,000 square foot facility, brand new. And here's some old renderings of the Bronx shelter, old renderings of the new animal shelter, I should say. So as you can see, it's going to be a really beautiful facade. As I click through here, actually, let me show you. Oops, I think I got rid of the part of the rendering, which shows that we're also going to have a wildlife rehabilitation center that is attached to the Bronx Animal Shelter, which is a really exciting addition to the animal shelter. As many of you already know, Animal Care Centers is the city's open admissions shelter, and so they have to receive every animal that crosses their threshold. They do not have the luxury of saying, like, you know, we have too many pit bulls today, or we don't take wildlife. Any animal that shows up, they must take. And so they actually spend a significant amount of energy and resources on wildlife that comes to the shelter. And so the addition of a wildlife rehabilitation center is going to be huge for animal care centers. It's going to create a natural partnership with a nonprofit entity who can run that wildlife rehabilitation center. And there can be a smooth transition, you know, once wildlife arrives at the shelter, they can say, like, oh, you know, this is the area where we receive companion animals. You can actually go right next door and they'll take care of you with the wildlife. So that's going to be a great thing. All right. Also, as a part of the Bronx Animal Shelter, there's a lot of programming that goes along with the Bronx Animal Shelter. So during the ULURP process, there was a lot of concern that came from the community around, like, you know, how are you going to engage the community and the residents that live in this area? What kinds of value add are you going to have for our schools and for our seniors? And so there was a lot of discussion and negotiation that happened. And what we arrived at that actually, I think, makes the animal shelter an even stronger shelter is that we're going to add in a pre-vet program pipeline, which is going to provide opportunities for the high school students right across the street. So Co-op City is right across the street from the new Bronx Animal Shelter. There's a beautiful educational campus right across the street called the Truman High School Educational Campus. On that campus, there are actually several high schools that are housed on that campus, many of which require their students to engage in community service in order to graduate. And so the animal shelter is going to provide opportunities for those students to fulfill their community service requirements, working with animals, but also for the students who are interested in STEM careers. This is also an interesting opportunity for them to get their feet wet in veterinary medicine and animal care and management. And so since the Bronx Animal Shelter is going to also include a significant veterinary component for the community, this is a place where students who are interested in veterinary medicine can volunteer, can also receive a little bit of mentorship and get exposure to potential careers in veterinary medicine. Okay, so moving along to co-sheltering, this was another thing that really came from the advocacy community. And when I started in this position, sort of as the community liaison, as somebody who was talking to animal advocates about the things that were important to the community, this came up quite a bit. So in New York City, there are currently limited options for people who are experiencing housing crises who are pet owners. So our homeless shelter system is largely not pet friendly, and that is a problem that they have recognized and are currently working on. And this came through a lot of conversation and kind of creative problem solving. And so there is an open-ended RFP out soliciting expressions of interest and proposals for safe havens, which are a low barrier option for people experiencing homelessness. So these are shelters that are really designed for people who have needs that don't traditionally get met in a traditional or conventional shelter setting. So safe havens have individual rooms. They're also considered low barrier. And so people with pets and partners and probably also many possessions have access to a shelter system which would welcome them. So that is underway, and we are eagerly awaiting a safe haven that will open up on the Upper West Side sometime next year or the following year that will accept people and their pets together. So the next thing I'd like to cover is the New York City Emergency Management's Animal Planning Task Force. New York City Emergency Management is the department in New York City which is responsible for coordinating all those emergency responses. That's really any emergency response, whether it be a fire or a hurricane or anything in that realm. So there is a special task force within emergency management dedicated to planning for animals in disasters. It's called the Animal Planning Task Force, and it is made up of both city agencies and external partners in the nonprofit realm. So if you take a look at this flyer on your left and you take a look down at the bottom of the flyer, there are a number of logos that you see here. These are our nonprofit partners with the exception of my office's logo in the upper right-hand corner. The nonprofit partners which make up the Animal Planning Task Force are the ASPCA, Animal Care Centers of New York City, the Humane Society, Bidewee, Animal Haven, Red Cross, the Mayor's Alliance for New York City's Animals, New York City Veterinary Emergency Response Team, New York State Animal Protection Federation, Best Friends, and Paws New York. So it's quite a sizable group that's come together around this issue. Some of our city partners, which you can see two of our logos here. I'm obviously there as a part of the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare. And then everyone is coordinated by New York City Emergency Management, but we also have representation from Department of Homeless Services, Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and a number of other city agencies. So we came together in a very different way in 2020 in response to COVID. And so during COVID, there was really no plan that was appropriate to respond to COVID and animals who were affected by COVID. We have a disaster animal response plan, but that plan was really crafted to respond to animals in natural disasters like hurricanes and floods. COVID being a completely different beast, we had to mobilize quickly and we had to basically redraft the whole thing. And so what we came up with is a two-pronged approach to animals during the pandemic. The first prong was this New York City COVID-19 pet hotline, which you can see the flyer for on your left. This was the public-facing part of the plan, where people who were facing emergencies because of COVID, whether that be financial or a health-related emergency, or they were just really nervous about how COVID would affect their animals, they could call into the hotline and talk to an actual person. They can talk to an operator, which was staffed by the ASPCA. The hotline was sort of the catch-all for public inquiries. And depending on what the concern was, the operator could either educate that person right there or provide resources for either free or drastically reduced cost veterinary care. They could also connect people to free pet food if that was a need. If there was an emergency that was more severe than that and it required more kind of hands-on case management, then the case would be escalated to the second tier of the plan, and that was called the COVID-19 Resource Desk. And that was essentially staffed by people who had social work and case management experience. Examples of cases that would go through that tier of the plan were people who had already been hospitalized due to COVID and they left a pet in the apartment with nobody to care for them, or they were people who were facing some sort of housing crisis related to their economic situation and being impacted by COVID, and they didn't know how to care for their animal. And so those kinds of cases that needed a social worker's touch were also dealt with through the COVID-19 Pet Response Plan. So the first phase of the COVID-19 Pet Response Plan ran through from April through early October. And during that first phase, we saw over 19,000 animals come through the hotline and either be dealt with the first phase of the hotline or they would get escalated to the second phase of the COVID-19 Pet Response Plan. Those 19,000 plus animals represented about 11 to 12,000 cases. And so we're extremely proud of this work. We are grateful to the ASPCA and also to animal care centers and all of the different nonprofits that you see on this flyer for kicking in resources and really personnel to staff the hotline and also provide resources like emergency veterinary care and pet food in order to really help New Yorkers who are in crisis during COVID. So the hotline was sunset in October. It's currently now back on, and it was turned back on in response to the second wave of COVID, which really hit New York later in the fall. The hotline is still functional, but it's a little bit, it operates a little bit differently because our COVID numbers are looking pretty good. And people aren't really in the emergency mode that they were in previously. The hotline is now not staffed by live operators, but there is a pre-recorded message that directs people to the right place. And they can also always email the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare if there's something that they need that is not addressed through the hotline. So that includes anyone who's watching today. If there's anything that you need or questions that you have, resources that you want to inquire about, you can always reach the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare. And we will do our best to find you the answers that you're looking for. So there are two different ways to reach us. You can reach us through our website, which is, and we'll type the web address in the chat in a moment, but it's basically nyc.gov/animal welfare. There's a contact us form on that website that you can go to. You can fill out your information there and somebody will get back to you. Otherwise, you can also just email us if that's what you would like to do. And you can email me at ckim2@cau.nyc.gov. And I will generally try to respond to you within 24 hours, although I have to warn you, the website is probably a better place to go for your help after tomorrow because I am taking a leave of absence. So starting Thursday, really the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare website is the best way to get a hold of somebody from this unit and from this office. You can still email me at my personal email address, which I've just put in the chat, and I will do my best to kind of route you to the right place. Okay. So with that, I am pretty much done with the deck and with the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. Do you mind typing the URL into the chat so we can put it into the comments?
Absolutely. So I just went ahead and put it in the chat.
Great. I'll put that into the comments. So once again, if you are having any issues or need assistance, here is the website and I'll show that here, down here, nyc.gov/animal welfare. Also, we'll put up Christine's email address here as well. But again, after tomorrow, this is the best way to get a hold of somebody. After is the website. So I guess I'll start us off. And if anybody out there does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the comments and we'll put them up. And we'll also do a drawing for a prize. So anybody who asks a question and who's a brave soul will get a prize at the end. So before I start my first question, just want to introduce Galit Sadiq. She's also from ARF as well. So just wanted to say hi to Galit. And the first question I guess we'll start off with is, the hotline's a really great idea. Do you foresee something like this happening in the future, where people can just call a number and, let's say they're having, they're having troubles financially, because we all know past COVID, there are people who are struggling. And they don't know what to do. They don't know the resources to go to. Do you foresee something like this happening in the future, maybe through 311 or getting directed to the mayor's office, or what do you see envision happening there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So currently, even though the COVID-19 pet hotline is it exists a little bit differently than it did in the beginning. It's not staffed by live operators. So in a way, it's been sunset, not officially, but it exists differently and it's a little less intense. We can scale it back up basically at any time. So now that we have the model for the way it operates, should COVID, God forbid, rear its ugly head again, we can scale it back up and basically have live operators staff it again. When we did have live operators staffing it, and during that first wave of COVID, we did actually have it connected to 311. And so anyone who called 311 and said COVID-19 and pets, or said anything within that realm and hit a keyword, then they would get directed to the COVID-19 hotline.
Got it. But there's nothing moving forward, thinking past COVID, that they wouldn't get directed to, or
so you mean
that'll end up being a future resource?
A general animal welfare hotline?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We don't have the capacity to do that in the moment with the Office of Animal Welfare. Basically, people reach the Office of Animal Welfare by phone if they have my desk line, which also I'm happy to share. But I'm a resource for the community, and I'm here, and I'm not, my phone number is not a secret. But again, I am taking a leave, so that does complicate some things. The office went into effect in March of 2020. And so the rollout of the office coincided with COVID. And the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare did not get the resources that it needed to really scale up. And so currently, the Office of Animal Welfare is truly just me. And hopefully that changes in the future, and especially with things sort of returning back to normal, and hopefully with kind of budget priorities also going back to normal, we'll see more resources come into the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, and hopefully there will be more than just one staff person in it. And once that becomes available, I think a hotline, just a general hotline for animal welfare concerns, is a wonderful idea.
Great, thank you. Karen, and sorry, go ahead, Galit.
Sorry, so I have just a question. When people do contact you or contact the hotline, what can they expect?
Yeah, I'll start with the hotline. With the hotline, there are really a couple of key services that are available. So one, if people just have general questions about COVID-19 and animals, they can get their questions answered there. They can also get them answered on the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare website. There's like a nice drop-down menu with some frequently asked questions about COVID and animals. But that was really critical in the beginning because there was so much that was just not understood about COVID and transmission and how it affects our companion animals. And so that information became really critical to just get it out into the community and tell people like, hey, there's no evidence right now that COVID transmits, that companion animals transmit COVID to people. And like, you don't need to worry about like dropping off your animal to the shelter if that's a concern of yours. Like, that's really what we were trying to avoid with that information, is that we did not want people to panic and drop their animals off at the shelter because there was a concern that COVID was somehow transmitting between people and animals in that way. Since then, we have learned that people can transmit COVID to their companion animals, and we've had a couple of those cases right here in New York City. We've also learned that people can transmit COVID to wildlife, and that wildlife can transmit COVID between each other. So there's a lot that we're learning consistently every day. But anyway, that basic information is available through the hotline and on our website. If people need access to reduced cost or free veterinary care because they have been economically impacted by COVID, that's also something that they can get connected to. So again, we're so lucky that the ASPCA is headquartered here in New York City and that they really took the helm of the COVID-19 PAD hotline. And so because they have the ASPCA hospital and the community veterinary clinics and also the mobile clinics and also, like lots of veterinary partners throughout the city, they're able to help with a number of cases. So that's a wonderful, really valuable resource that's available. Also early on in COVID, there was a lot of effort just to provide the basics, the simple things that would really lead to good pet retention. And so if people were impacted economically and they couldn't afford pet food, then ASPCA was also giving out loads of free pet food to people, just being like, here, let us take care of the basics, keep your animal with you, don't take it to the shelter. And so those things are still available. If you need a higher level of care, there is still a mechanism for getting that kind of care. And so again, you can always contact the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare through our contact us form. You can call the hotline, leave a message. And then there's also behavior resources that are available to a limited extent. And I know I'm leaving out loads of good stuff. Oh, yes, of course. How could I forget? There's also resources for people who are facing eviction. So that was another thing that came out of the COVID work. So now that we're sort of past the emergency phase of COVID, and we're not, we still are living with COVID. There are people who are still affected by it and their health is affected by it. But at this point, largely, we're sort of dealing with the aftermath of COVID and the economic impacts. And a lot of people in the animal welfare world are really concerned about like how this impacts housing and being a city of renters, New York City, like how is this going to impact the eviction rate? And so we've done a lot of work around that and making sure that as a part of our animal planning task force, we're pulling in human service partners. That's like my whole thing at the Office of Animal Welfare, is that we need integrated human and animal services, because you can't really have a good safety net for companion animals without having a really strong safety net for humans. And these two entities, these two branches need to be talking to each other and working together to really come up with the best outcomes for everyone. So we have the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants. That's a part of our animal planning task force now. And they have a tenant protection hotline, which people can get connected to through 311 if you need help with fighting your eviction, or you just need legal resources, advice, what have you. That 311 tenant protection hotline is also like a catch-all for any housing related issues. And now they also are asking questions about pets. So if you are a tenant who is facing eviction and you have a pet, please let us know, and if the answer is yes, I have a pet and I'm facing eviction, then you get routed to a very special program. And big shout out to Animal Haven. Some of you may be familiar with Animal Haven. They're a smaller shelter in Manhattan, but they have an amazing community outreach and engagement department, which is spearheaded by a social worker. And again, that social worker really does a lot to integrate human and animal services. And so that person is really able to help with some of these more hands-on cases where people who are facing eviction with a pet really need somebody to hold their hand and think through all of their options, maybe plan for their pet. And if it comes down to surrendering your animal, because you really just can't keep it there, no other options, does it have to go to the animal shelter? Or are there people in your life who can take that animal? And so, that work manifests in a lot of different ways, but the point is, at the end of the day, integrated human and animal services. So that tenant protection work, that pet owner eviction project is also a part of our task force, and people can get connected to that through the COVID-19 pet hotline as well. So that's a long answer for what people can expect from the COVID-19 pet hotline. If you call me and you get connected to me through my phone, or if you get a hold of us via email, it's basically, again, like any animal issue under the sun. It's not just companion animals. So if you have a raccoon that you think is sick in your backyard, you can also call me. If you're concerned that, the carriage horses are working in temperatures that are too hot, you can call me. I mean, I can't promise that I have the answer that you like for you, but I will at least track down the answer, and that's the honest truth. And I'm lucky that I have really good fellows with me. So Katerina, who's here on screen, she's a fellow from the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, and she provides a lot of support. Her and a couple of other fellows who have been just amazing. They have really expanded the capacity of the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare, and so now it's not just me sort of responding to all of these different inquiries, all animal issues citywide, right? So I can shop things out to fellows, and they can also track down answers and help connect people to resources.
And are the fellows, is that a specific, Katerina, would you like to tell us a little bit about your fellowship?
Sure.
And what it involves?
So it kind of ranges from, I guess, regular constituent filtering. So just making sure anything that does come through goes to the right place. And then also, since the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare is housed in CAU, the Community Affairs Unit, it could also be related to stuff outside of the Animal Welfare Office, but primarily just supporting Christine in any projects she may need help with, and also doing research on issues that might come in and just looking up legal kind of terms and how to either get around things or pursue the right course of action when it comes to stuff that may come in.
And how did you get involved with, how did you find is it a fellowship, or is it through a school, or how does that work?
So I'm actually a master's student at NYU in animal studies. So just through, I guess, circulation of fellowships that might be relevant to, I guess, our focus, the Animal Welfare Fellowship came up, and I was really excited to apply, and thankfully I got it. So I'm here now.
Sorry, and I have one more thing I wanted to kind of follow up with what Christine said. I know that I've been hearing it a lot more from pet owners that aren't able to keep their pets and they don't have someone that they can give it to, and they're worried about surrendering. Is there right now, or will there be any kind of program in place that if they do need to surrender it, will there be a way for them to get their pet back when they're back on their feet?
Oh gosh, yeah. If we're talking about long-term foster, I think the options are actually very limited, to be very honest. If we're talking about short-term foster, that's different. But long-term foster is such a hard one, especially when you don't really have an end date, like a hard end date. And I think it's hard for shelters of any size to find fosters who are willing to sort of just hold on to an animal indefinitely. I would say that the best thing that we have that can help address that issue is we do have a really strong like pet retention team and kind of shelter diversion programs in many different places. So I can speak a little bit more to just like animal care centers, since they are the city's animal shelter provider. Their admissions team does the best that they can. They like really try to turn over every stone when it comes to like, if you want to keep your animal and you just don't have the resources to do that, let's find out what we can do or what we can provide to help you keep your animal. Because the animal shelter also doesn't want to take your animal if you don't want to surrender it. Right? So if it's a matter of finding that low cost veterinary care or providing you with pet food, those are options to explore. I know that there are other things that are higher cost and just like harder to solve that come up, like housing. That's a difficult one that like the animal shelter just doesn't have the answer to. But that's why Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare on the policy side is looking at like pet accessible housing and keeping people and pets together in shelters and that kind of thing. I would say that the other resources that are available outside of animal care centers really come from like this, the people who are part of Animal Planning Task Force, who are also social workers and like have a foot in both worlds in human services and animal services. So like Animal Haven, their community outreach and engagement department, that social worker does a lot in terms of like helping people get their animals to be emotional support animals if they have some sort of disability. And sometimes that will help with the housing piece of things. So like if somebody is entering into a shelter or has faced some sort of emergency and is going into temporary housing at HPD, then sometimes having that emotional support animal letter and like going through the reasonable accommodation process is helpful. Not 100% of the time, but sometimes. And that social worker can help like advocate and hold a person's hand through that process. But those are really like the best tools that we have. And I'm the first one to admit that's not sufficient. We need more tools to help people and animals stay together. And we have looked at how to do that effectively. And in fact, stay tuned for some reporting or some publications on like pets and housing and pet retention in general.
Karen, any questions from you?
Hello. I basically want to say thank you for enlightening us on all of this information. I am really excited about this whole entire part of the New York City. It's a shame that because it started in COVID, basically, that I hope that the city is going to put some money into marketing this to our city and getting the information out there. One of the things while we were talking about relocating and helping pets stay together, something came to my attention to bring up that we see a lot of people when they move, perhaps. We see a lot of people get stuck in situations where they cannot take their pet with them because a landlord will not allow pets. Is this something that this department could perhaps help people with in the future?
I want to say yes. So we're looking at that very closely right now. In fact, we have somebody on our team who, again, is a fellow, but her whole focus and purpose is to look at pets and housing and like why people surrender their animals if it's a housing related issue. And she actually did like a really deep dive on animal shelter intake data and like if it's categorized as housing related, like what are the subcategories, like what are the details there? And one of the top reasons was that people move and they have a really hard time just finding pet friendly units. And that surrender happens when people are moving.
Sad. Yeah.
It is very sad. And so we're looking at like the different ways to address that and what can really be done on our end. And what we're finding is that like actually some of the data is really surprising, and I don't necessarily want to spoil it because the report is going to come out eventually really soon. But kind of, I'll give you a sneak peek on what you'll find in the report. Is that when we actually break down the types of animals that get surrendered in housing related types of situations, we were expecting the majority to be large dogs. Like that's just what we assumed we would find, but that's not the case. Actually, the majority of animals are cats that get surrendered in housing related situations, which we were all like, we were not expecting that. Followed by small dogs, or you know what? I'll stop myself from commenting on the types, the dog breakdown. So it was mostly cats, and followed by very closely by dogs. And then when you break down the sizes of the dogs, then it gets a little bit more detailed. But anyway, in terms of encouraging pet-friendly housing, we think that the low-hanging fruit is actually to encourage landlords to accept cats. And if there was a cats welcome policy, it doesn't address the entire problem, but it certainly addresses like at least 50% of the problem. And a lot of the reasons why landlords are reluctant to take animals, it's not all relevant to cats. So if landlords and developers are concerned about dog bites or like large dogs or dogs damaging the property, or dogs barking, or waste elimination in inappropriate places, like those are all dog things, not cat things. We do want to address the dog issue, of course, because at animal care centers, if we're going to be serious about reducing the intake, we need to come up with solutions for large dogs. And so we do want to get there, but the low-hanging fruit absolutely is like encouraging a cats welcome here policy.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Galit or Karen, if you have one. Okay. Well, Christine and Katerina, thank you so much for your time and talking to us about what the Mayor's Office of Animal Welfare does. It's really exciting to see that there is something that's being created in New York City finally, and that hopefully this will be a resource that will just keep growing. And I know especially out here, it is something that is very much needed. So I just wanted to thank you again for your time. Again, if anybody has anything that they, that they're looking for, or any resources, it is nyc.gov/animal welfare. And then Christine, can they call 311 and get directed, or is that just for COVID?
That's mostly just for COVID. I can leave my desk line in the chat as well. And when that happens, it generates an email, which I can then forward on to the rest of my team after I take leave.
Got it. Great. Just for those people who may not be connected to the internet.
Absolutely.
And of course, we will post this on our website, in our blog, our newsfeed, after it finishes generating. And then we'll also post all of the resources, all of the great stuff that Christine was talking about, the links and the number on our website for you to share. Visit our website at arfrockaway.org. There you can find videos, you can find our past SPAR calls, has lots of great information, lots of resources. And then wanted to let everybody know that our next SPAR call will actually be at the dog park on July 27th at 6 p.m. We'll do a rain date of July 28th, so the following evening will be at 6 p.m., same time. And in keeping with city guidelines, we request that everybody please wear a mask. Just want to keep everybody safe. So hope to see everybody there. Please spread the word, and we will see you on July 27th. Feel free to email us also at arfrockaway@gmail.com should you have any questions. All right. Thanks again to our presenters and to everybody at ARF. From all of us, have a good night.